All right. So today we are going to be learning lesson 5 of our World of Kabbalah series. This one is called The Great Concealment. Today we're talking about one of the more subtle, one of the more complicated, one of the more difficult, morning Lisa, topics in Kabbalah. But I think it's one of the more powerful ideas in Kabbalah. And the way the way we've been structuring it, that every week we talk first about the macrocosm, about the godliness, and then the microcosm, the second half of class about the human being. I think this class is the parallel to the microcosm is really, truly life-changing stuff that we can learn from the Kabbalah, that we can learn from Chassidus. But before we jump off into the actual class, today is another very important day on the Chabad calendar. You're all very lucky that this year they all happen on a Sunday. Today is known as the 5th of Tevis, or Hey Tevis, the way we say it in Hebrew. Hey Tevis was the day. Just to give you a little bit of historical background, basically in the late 80s, a relative of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, actually the Lubavitcher Rebbe, our Rebbe, was the son-in-law of the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe. The previous Lubavitcher Rebbe had 2 sons-in-law. So a grandson to the other son-in-law of the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe claimed that he should have access, he should have ownership of some of the library of the previous Rebbe. Okay? Part of when the previous Rebbe left Russia, when he left the old country, he also took with him the Chabad library that has hundreds of years of rare manuscripts of both Hasidic works and other things that had never been printed, even handwritten notes by his father, his grandfather, by the founders of Chabad, precious artifacts, things like that. And it became, so I just got to let people into the Zoom, sorry. And it became the library of the Chabad movement, basically. So one of the grandchildren of the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe claimed that he should have access to those books. He should have ownership of the books.
Ownership is different from access.
Yes. So he wanted ownership. And his argument was that as the heir of, sorry guys, I just need to fix this. As the only living, as one of the heirs of the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, those books should belong to him. Those books should belong to them. And some of those books were actually worth 7 figures plus, because incredibly rare stuff, things that nobody else had copies of, literally. Many of those things were never printed up to that point. And the Rebbe insisted that it belongs to the movement, right? The Rebbe's argument basically was that the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe was not a personal individual. He wasn't a person who amassed a private collection to study from, to enjoy. He collected this collection for the Chabad movement, for all the Hasidim, as we say. And it ended up, sadly, in secular court. In general, in Judaism, when something ends up in secular court, it's considered, like we say, a busha, a shandafar de goyim, right? We're supposed to be able to handle things amongst ourselves, and they ended up in public court. But at the end of the day, the courts agreed with the Rebbe that the Frierdiker Rebbe, the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, was not an individual. He was the leader of a movement. So all those books belong to the movement. So the Rebbe saw this as a vindication of the whole idea of a Chabad movement, of a Hasidic movement. That this isn't just a personal thing, that one man wants to amass a private collection, wants to amass power for himself, wants to amass honor, wants to become a Rebbe, but there's a movement that we're trying to accomplish something together as a people, and that the books belong to the people, not to an individual, but it belongs to the people. And the Rebbe was very, you could see very clearly that the Rebbe was very disturbed by the whole court case, and after it was settled, the Rebbe was very, not settled, when it was adjudicated in the Rebbe's favor, and not in the Rebbe's favor, in the favor of the Kabbalah Lubavitcher movement, the Rebbe took that very personally as a vindication of the whole idea. And the Rebbe actually said that today is the day for the books, literally. So what we're supposed to do, we're supposed to appreciate Jewish books. We should buy Jewish books. The Rebbe actually said there's 2 things that the Rebbe talked about. That just having books in your home, Jewish books in your home, is powerful. In and of itself, just having those Jewish books in your home is powerful. And I'll just give you a very practical way. Let's say when you have a house full of Jewish books, what do your children see? What do people coming to your home see? It's a house of Jewish learning, a house of Jewish books. There's an old joke on the TV show Friends. Remember Friends? Right? So this guy Joey, the moron of the show, he meets somebody, he's dating a girl or something, I don't remember the scenario, but she says, oh, I don't have a television. So Joey says, so what do you point all your furniture at? Right? So when you have books in your house, when you have Svarim in your house, what you're saying is, what's my furniture pointing to? Right? All the furniture in my house is pointing to what? To the Jewish books. The Rebbe says, obviously, once you have those books, hopefully you take them down off the shelf every once in a while and crack them open and learn something. That's also valuable. So a day like Hey Tevis, Not also valuable. Obviously, that's the ultimate purpose that we should learn from those books. So the day of Hey Tevis is supposed to be a day that we appreciate Jewish books, but ultimately Jewish learning. By the way, because we talked about it, this was a vindication of the Rebbe saw it as a vindication of the Kabbalah Babish movement. What actually is the Kabbalah Babish movement? We talked about it at the beginning of this course. The Chabad is not just a place where you could get a schnitzel sandwich when you're in Thailand or in the Virgin Islands. It's also a philosophy. What is this philosophy? Where does it come from? So I'll tell you the truth. Yesterday, when I was davening here in Shul, if you come here to Shul, Beaches, you've probably seen it. I sit in the back, right? I sit over here in the corner, right? Because I like to, just do my own thing when I'm davening, and sometimes chapa shmuz, whatever. Fine. So I'm davening davening towards the end of davening, and sometimes when you daven, as we've been learning in this course, part of davening is you're supposed to try to connect. So I was feeling pretty good about sometimes when we daven, you're supposed to try to connect. So I had a rare moment of connection. Like I was feeling good about what I learned that morning, what I was meditating on. So I was davening. And then I hear a baby crying from the ladies section, right? Somebody brought a baby to the ladies section and the baby starts crying. And at first I'm very disturbed. The baby's crying. I'm like, I can't think. And then I thought about a very famous story with the founder of Chabad and his son and his grandson. So the founder of Chabad, his name was Reb Shneur Zalman, who was known as the Alter Rebbe, which literally means the old rabbi. He had a son known as the Mittel Rebbe, which literally means the middle rabbi. Okay, the middle rabbi, because whatever. So they lived in a house, one on top of the other. They lived in the same building. Alter Rebbe lived upstairs. The Mittel Rebbe lived downstairs. So the Alter Rebbe one night he's studying in his room. He's learning, and he hears a baby crying, and the baby doesn't stop crying. So finally he goes upstairs, and he realizes that his son had been either davening or learning. I can't remember. Had either been praying or studying so intently that the baby, something happened to the baby, and he didn't notice. He didn't hear the baby crying because he was so engrossed with his learning. So the Alter Rebbe quieted the baby down, and the next morning he called his son into his study, and he told him that no matter, obviously, davening and learning is the ideal. That's what we're supposed to be doing. But when a Jewish baby is crying, we have to hear the cry, ultimately. And this is really what the Chabad Lubavitch philosophy is. In one short story, is that as much as we're trying to learn and grow as people and try to come closer to Hashem, however that is, at the end of the day, when another person is crying, we have to hear that cry. And that's ultimately what the mission of Kabbalah Lubavitch is all about. And so that's what Hey Tevis was vindicating, this idea that we're not just here to study for ourselves and to connect for ourselves, we're also meant to hear the cry of other people when they're crying out. And the Rebbe said this is physical, obviously, but also spiritual. That when another Jew is crying out that they need something from us spiritually, we have to hear that cry. Okay. That was just a short introduction to talk about today's day, because I felt that I would be remiss if we didn't talk about it. All right, so today we're going to talk about something called Tzimtzum. Anyone ever hear of Tzimtzum before? Yeah? Tzimtzum. So first of all, Tzimtzum is an awesome word. Okay? It's a lot of fun to say. I was as I was preparing this class this week, I was listening to a class about Tzimtzum, and I had to drive Shua to school one day because he slept in, because it was Hanukkah, whatever. He's grumpy in the morning when he goes to sleep late. So I'm driving into yeshiva, and he hears a guy saying Tzimtzum. So I come home later in the afternoon, and he's just running around the house saying Tzimtzum, Tzimtzum, Tzimtzum. So what is Tzimtzum? We're going to talk about it soon. All right? What is Tzimtzum? So if you remember, we talked about how originally there was God's infinity, right? God's infinity. And then eventually we come down to the 10 Sefirot. What are the 10 Sefirot? The 10 divine attributes in the world of Atzilus. Correct? So now the question I present to you is, what's the problem with infinity? There's a problem with infinity.
It's not concentrated.
When you have infinity, what else can I have? Nothing, right? When you have infinity, if there's infinity, what else can there be? Nothing. So how do we get from a place of infinity to a place of definable, focused, attributable attributes of the 10 Sefirot? How does that happen? How do we go from an infinite light of God? How do you go from any infinite to something that's finite? Something drastic must have happened in order to go from a space of infinity to a space where other things are able to exist. Just to give you an example, if you came to New York in 1750, what was happening in New York in 1750? Who was in charge? Who was in charge in 1750? 1750, not 1650. The British were in charge, right? The British were in charge, right? The Dutch were in charge, let's say 1650. I don't remember when the sale with Stuyvesant happened. but the British were in charge 1750. You come back, you jump back into your time machine, you jump to 1800. What happened? Who's in charge? We're in charge, right? We're in charge. We were the capital for like a couple of weeks, right? Right, something like that. Yeah. No, I said the capital of the United States. Yeah. So something drastic must have happened in those 50 intervening years, right? You went from a state of British rule, of being a colony of Britain, to being the greatest country in the history of the world, right? So what actually happened? What was that? What's the word I'm looking for? Not the metamorphosis, the catalyst. What's the catalyst that was able? Something drastic must have happened between those in those 15 intervening years. What was that drastic catalyst? The shot heard around the world, right? The revolution, George Washington, all that good stuff. A Boston Tea Party, boom, boom, bang. We have America. Something drastic happened to change the facts on the ground. So if we're talking about the world of godliness, the world of Ishtalshalos, this order of devolution, to go from a space of divine infinity to these 10 very focused things, and definitely to go even further to these tangible worlds that feel themselves as distinct entities of created beings outside of godliness. Our world, we don't even think of ourselves as beings that are dependent on God's creation. So how do you go from a space up here, this bright shining light of divine infinity, the Or Ein Sof, if you remember, the way we described it last week, the light of the infinite, or the infinite light, how do you go from that to 10 definable, attributable sefirot and qualities? That's right. So we have this, even Lesei Tohu, even we said last week, the world of chaos. But chaos, there were still 10 defined things, correct? It didn't end up working, obviously it was part of God's plan, etc., etc. We could go listen to last week's recording for all those details. But they were specific things. How do you have specificity out of infinity? How does finitude come from the infinite? How does that work? It can't. It shouldn't be able to work. When you have infinity, there should be no other space for anything else. How do we jump from divinity to a space of finitude, of selfhood? That's actually the big question. Go from a sense of infinity to selfhood, which is, selfhood is really, it's a crazy thing if you think about it. All the things we're learning about Kabbalah, the idea that we should have selfhood is, it's radical. That there should be a being that sees itself not only as independent of God, but even able to deny God's existence. It's a wild, wild thing. So what was that shot heard around the world? What was that Lexington? What was the Boston Tea Party that accomplished that, to change the facts on the ground so radically that we were able to go from the Or Ein Sof, from the infinite, to ultimately the 10 divine attributes, the Sefirot, then to our physical world, which has the Yeshus, the existence with self-awareness and independence. So to do that, we're going to introduce one of the fundamental, and I'm not joking, one of the fundamental texts of Kabbalah. This is a text from the Arizal. We brought up the Arizal's names a few times. The Arizal lived a couple of hundred years ago in Safas, Rabbi Isaac Luria, and he actually never wrote anything himself, but he had one of his students by the name of Reb Chaim Vital. He was his approved stenographer, I guess you could say. So here in text 1, we're on page 143. On page 143, text 1, we have a foundational idea of Lurianic Kabbalah, the Kabbalah of the Ari, in which the Ari introduces to us this idea of Tzimtzum. Shalom. You have text 1 where it says before and after?
Yeah, sure. Before and for the creation was created, a simple divine light filled all of reality. It had no aspect of beginning or end. It is called Or Ein Sof. Is that right?
Yeah.
The infinite light. When it arose in his will to create the world and to emanate the absolute, he contracted his infinite light, and an empty space emerged. He then projected downward a single straight line from his circular light, devolving into this empty space. Within this empty space, he emanated creative fashion and made all world.
Fantastic. Good job, Shalom. So what did we just say?
Yeah, we just said that a distraction. He took his light, beamed it through something, spread in different ways, in specific blue light. That's what he said.
So it's very important for us to remember. Remember the first class we talked about Amelia Bedelia? We have to be very careful that we're not going to be Amelia Bedelia here. You cannot take these things literally. I can't remember. I think it was Dr. Puro who raised up. There's this idea that you're not supposed to learn Kabbalah before you turn 40. Do you know where this idea comes from? Because the Kabbalists were worried that people would take things literally. that until you reach a certain age, you don't have enough subtlety in your mind to be able to appreciate things as a metaphor. And that's why Kabbalah was kept a secret for so many years, because there was this fear that people take things literally. So we have to be very careful that we are that we don't look at things literally. We're not Amelia Bedelia drawing the curtains, right? Talking about lights and circles and all these different things. What does it mean lights? What does it mean circles? What's going on over here? What does it mean empty space? So what we're talking about here, hey guys, good morning. What we're talking about here, this is the introduction. This is the foundational text that discusses the idea of tzimtzum. If I had to define the word tzimtzum, I would have a very hard time defining it, but we could use the word contraction, making yourself smaller. So that the idea is that the Arizal says, how do we deal with this issue of God taking up all the space? Infinity is taking up all space. How could the world exist? So God contracts himself. Okay? So let's take this text actually step by step, paragraph by paragraph. In the first paragraph, we said that before everything else, in the beginning, the capital B, in the beginning, what existed? A simple divine light filled all of reality. And by simple, we mean undefinable, ungraspable, infinite. That's what we mean by simple. Unadulterated, just pure, infinite godliness. So then, God wanted to contract his infinite light, and an empty space emerged. By the way, we use the metaphor of a circle. Why do we use the metaphor of a circle? To talk about God's infinity? There's no beginning, there's no end. Right? That's what infinite means. There's no beginning, there's no end. But then we say that God made space within the circle. He removed himself from the circle. He contracted his infinite light, and an empty space emerged, and then he projected downward a straight line. What is a line? What's important? What's the difference between a line and a circle? A line is definable. It has a beginning and an end. Very good. That's what a line is. A circle, in contrast, is the infinity. And within this empty space, let's look at the very last line of text 1. Within this empty space, he emanated, created, fashioned, and made all worlds. By the way, these 4 expressions of emanated, created, fashioned, and made all worlds is parallel to the 4 worlds of Atzilus, Bria, Yetzira, and Asiya. Jimmy.
So we were created in darkness.
So first there's darkness.
It's like taking away the light to create darkness, the empty space.
So very simply. So very simply, there's first disruption. Disruption is what? Tzimtzum, I'm sorry, is this disruption that, so to speak, removes God's. By the way, I mentioned to you before how Shua was in the car and he heard all about Tzimtzum. Shua actually asked if he could stay home so he could come to the class today so he could learn about Tzimtzum. But Shua, we're gonna have to be quiet, all right, bud?
Teach me later.
Okay. So what we're saying, what it seems that the Arizal is saying, what we're saying in text number 1, is that God created an empty space and then took a single straight line of energy and shined it through that light. Shined it through that darkness. Then he removes the light, empty space, and into that empty space projects one limited aspect of light. Okay, that's what it seems that we seem to be saying here. A second, let me figure out these slides. I'm sorry. Right. And again, we have to make sure that we remember that we're not Amelia Bedelia. What's this one? What's the light bulbs? What's the joke with the light bulbs? Anybody remember? No. Amelia Bedelia. Amelia Bedelia specifically. Put out the lights. Okay, that's what it was. Her boss told her to put out the lights, so she takes the lights and puts it on the outside. Okay. So Tzimtzum seems to be saying, this text 1 seems to be telling us that God created an empty space. That's the void of godliness. That's the void of God. So now, what does this seem to say? That there is a space that is devoid of God. It's godless, right? That's godless. And if we take this doctrine of Tzimtzum literally, what are we saying? That there's a space, that this whole world was created in a way that God removes himself from the equation, so to speak. But while there were Kabbalists in previous generations who felt that way, the Hasidic doctrine of understanding this Tzimtzum is that Tzimtzum is a lav kipshute.
What?
Tzimtzum lav kipshute. That means Hebrew. I'm saying that in Hebrew, meaning that Tzimtzum is not literal. We're not talking literally when we say Tzimtzum. And the reason why we can't say that Tzimtzum is literal is because we know, based on many other sources, that where is God? Where is God? God is everywhere. So how could we say, how could the Arizal come and tell us that God made a tzimtzum, God contracted himself, made a space devoid of this light, if God is everywhere? They don't work together. The Kabbalah tells us very clearly, the Zohar tells us very clearly, Leis asar panui mine, which means there is no space devoid of him, capital H him. So how can we say that there's a tzimtzum, a contraction of God's light where God removes himself from the picture, if God is everywhere? What's actually going on over here? So, Jimmy, I'm going to ask you to read text 2a and text 2b, where a Kabbalist around the same time of the Arizal, a few years later, explains to us why we cannot take this doctrine of tzimtzum literally. Besides the fact, he raises this idea that, first of all, we're talking about circles and lines, and obviously God is neither a circle, God is not a line. He raises other issues as well. Jimmy, please.
Those who wish to understand the tzimtzum in a literal manner will be led to believe that contradict most of the fundamentals of our faith. First of all, we were explicitly taught, whom do you compare God, and what likeness can you arrange for him? If, however, you take the tzimtzum literally, you are indeed imposing an image of God, an encompassing circle, an empty space, and a straight channel within that space.
So I was actually planning on saying a story before. The story goes that a follower of the Alter Rebbe by the name of Reb Shmuel Munkus, who was a very interesting person, but also a bit of a jokester. He was once traveling to the Alter Rebbe, and on his travels, he bumps into another person who was also traveling to the Alter Rebbe. So Reb Shmuel asked him why he's going to the Alter Rebbe, and over the course of the conversation, this chassid was able to see that this other individual had a real sense of what we call in Hebrew gaiva, a healthy sense of ego. He saw himself as an accomplished Kabbalist and a real big shot. And he was going to go speak to the Alter Rebbe because he had some questions about Kabbalah that he didn't really fully understand. But otherwise, he was I'm a giant myself, right? And Shmuel had the style that he didn't appreciate people with big egos, all right? So he wanted to teach this person a lesson. So he told this guy, I also am traveling to the Alter Rebbe, but I probably won't be able to get an appointment because I'm just a simple man. But I have a question about Kabbalah. And if you could please ask, maybe you can answer it for me. And if not, could you ask the Alter Rebbe? So the guy says, what's your question about Kabbalah? So he said, I read in a Kabbalistic work that the following phrase, okay, the following paragraph. In the beginning, it was spread all over. Afterward, it became connected as a large circle. Thereupon, it extended into single lines, becoming three-cornered with a dot in the middle. By blending the elements of water and fire, it was complete and good. So this Kabbalist hears this, and he's like, oh, that's a very good question. I have no idea what you're talking about. What's this? What's the Kabbalah saying over here? So he goes to the Alter Rebbe, and he tells the Alter Rebbe this whole thing about it. First, it was all dispersed, and then it became single lines, and then it became a triangle with a dot in the middle, and through blending the elements of fire and water together, it was good and complete. So Alter Rebbe listens to him, and he says, I think you're talking about kreplach, dumplings, right? First, it was all separate. It was just flour sitting around, and then you made it to long strips of dough. Then you made it to a triangle with a little piece of meat in the middle, and you used water and fire. You cooked it, and you made it good, right? So obviously he was embarrassed. He learned this lesson that we're supposed to learn Kabbalah in a way that brings us to more humility, not the opposite. So we learned this text from the Arizal. The Arizal is talking about circles and lines and empty space. Obviously, we're not talking about circles, lines, and empty space. There has to be something. There's a deeper, like we say in Hebrew, there's a deeper Havana here. There's a deeper understanding that we have to try to get to. There is a certain metaphor here that the Arizal is trying to convey in this text. So the first text, 2a, tells us, first of all, we're talking about space and circles and lines. Obviously, we're not taking it literally. God is neither a circle nor a line. We're talking about a metaphor. There's a deeper verstand, there's a deeper Havana, there's a deeper understanding that we have to get to. But besides for the fact that God is neither a circle nor a line, and God has no shape, has no form, and to ascribe those to God is heretical, so to speak, in a certain sense, this text, Rabbi Yosef Igras says he has another issue with this idea of taking tzimtzum literally. Jimmy, text 2b.
Additionally, the Zohar states numerous times that there is no place where he is not, from the highest of levels to the lowest of levels in every direction. If you suggest that the tzimtzum is literal, you are insinuating that there is a place devoid of it, for in this empty space, only a narrow channel is in.
So this brings us back to basically have the same issue. We're saying that tzimtzum is not literal, that God's light still fills the whole world. But at the same time, we have the same issue we had at the beginning of the class. Because if God's light is infinite, how much space is God's light taking up? How much? All of it. Whatever space there is, God's filling that space. How could there be finitude within the infinite? How does that work? And we're saying that Tzimtzum does not mean that God removes his light, because we're told very clearly that God is everywhere. How does that work? So we have to understand this, that Tzimtzum is a figurative thing. It's non-literal. It's non-literal. Text 3, let's read text 3 together on page 147. Page 147. You know what? I'll read. The Tzimtzum does not mean that God's infinite light departed, God forbid, for in truth there is no place devoid of him. It says all over the Zohar. There is no space where God is not. This principle is also expressed in the Medrash. Why did God choose to reveal himself to Moses from within a thorn bush? To teach that there is no place devoid of God's presence, even a thorn bush. The first time the most famous Jew ever, the greatest Jew ever meets God was where? God was hanging out in a thorn bush. The Medrash says, why the thorn bush? To tell us that God is not just in the mighty mountains, God is not just in the heavens, but even in the lonely thorn bush. So this idea of God being everywhere is not only a Kabbalistic idea, it's part of Midrashic and the Talmudic tradition as well. Instead, continues the Alter Rebbe, in this context, the meaning of Tzimtzum is that Or Ein Sof went from a state of revelation to one of concealment without actually departing at all. So here's where it gets complicated. Here's where it gets subtle. From our perspective, Tzimtzum happened. From God's perspective, nothing really changed. God is still everywhere. It's just no longer revealed. An example I thought of actually before Shabbos on Friday, I thought of an example. Let's see if it works. Great. If it doesn't, just throw it out. That's fine. I don't mind if you don't like my metaphors. That's okay. Anyone here ever done an escape room before? An escape room? No? Really? How does an escape room work, Lisa?
You go into one room.
Yeah.
And then it's sort of like a maze. You try to find your way out.
But there are all these different clues, and like if you
Right.
pick up the lamp and you turn it on its side, it says a number, then you go to the window pane, you touch it a certain amount of times, and each hint gives you to another hint. So now it's basically a long, complicated riddle. By the way, it's a great time with your grandkids, guys. It's a good idea. You're locked. It's great. It's a lot of fun. You're locked in a room and you have to escape. And the way you escape is that the puzzle maker or whatever, the riddle master, whatever you want to call him, left all these clues for you to find. So from your perspective, you're playing this game, you're trapped in the room, right? Right now, the door is locked, you're trapped, and there's no way for you to get out until you go through all these progressions. But the person watching, the person who designed the escape room, are you trapped in the room? Are you locked into this room? No, not at all. All you need to do is press this button in this sequence, get the key, and whatever, you're free. There's no limitation here. There is no constraint. There's no contraction. Verstehst? How does the metaphor work? From our perspective, we live in a world where that is limited. We see limitation all around us. We're in the escape room. From God's perspective, it's all infinite. There's all the same infinity is still all there. It's still all there. God never went anywhere. We don't see God because we're trapped in the escape room. God designed the escape room. By the way, this also helps us. This metaphor also kind of helps us explain why did God have to go through all this hassle, doing all these steps? Why do you have to have this whole long ladder, this whole long chain of events? It says in the Torah, God said, bam, right? God said, let there be light. There was light, and the world was created in 6 days. It's great. What do we need this whole rigmarole? So one of the things Kabbalah teaches us that God kind of put out that ladder, created the world in a chain in a ladder construct, because he climbed down the ladder to create this world, but also left it there for us to be able to climb back up. Right? Let's just keep that in mind. So when we're saying that Tzimtzum is non-literal, when we say that Tzimtzum is non-literal, we're saying that God's light never went anywhere. There is no space devoid of God. It's a fact that the Zohar tells us constantly, that is found all throughout Judaism. It's a very famous song. Hashem is here, Hashem is there, Hashem is truly everywhere. Right? Everybody knows this song. God is everywhere. How could you have the Tzimtzum? So Tzimtzum means something that is non-literal. And the way the Hasidic masters explain to us this Kabbalistic doctrine of Tzimtzum is that before Tzimtzum, God's infinite light was revealed. After Tzimtzum, God's infinite light was concealed. Okay? You have Helam and you have Gilui. On page 148, we have two key terms. Key term 5.3, we say the word Gilui, which means revelation. And they define it as a reality that is apparent. And in this context, we're talking about godliness. And they say Helam. Helam means concealment, a reality where God is a reality that is present but not apparent. A reality that is present and not apparent. By the way, even when we're talking about light, there's so many spectrums of light that you and I can't see. Right? It's still there. UV and radiation is there, but we can't see it. It's just not revealed to us until we're able to get the tools. In past the couple decades, we were able to develop the tools to be able to appreciate that light. So God's infinite light is still here. It didn't go anywhere. It's just no longer revealed. Before I'm going to open it to questions, obviously, but I want to give one more mashal, one more parable that will hopefully help us understand this idea of tzimtzum. This is also a mashal that we've been describing a few times, the parable of the teacher and the student. Right? Remember the Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton walks into a classroom and he's told, we want you to teach universal gravitation to a group of high school sophomores, right? Bunch of 16-year-olds. So if Newton wants to walk in and he tries to teach them everything that he knows, if he comes in as Sir Isaac Newton, what's going to happen? The kids aren't going to learn anything, correct? Because his mind is too vast. 1 second, everybody. We're going to put the heat up a little bit. We have to reveal the heat.
Kind of feel like I'm on Everest.
So again, we talked about this metaphor a few times, but if Sir Isaac Newton or your other favorite scientist, whoever you want it to be, walks into the classroom as he is, as they are, the students will not walk away with anything, right? If he walks in as Sir Isaac Newton, they're not going to get anything. And if he just decides he wants to have a conversation with them, he's going to talk about his favorite pizza toppings, the kids also aren't going to get Sir Isaac Newton, right? Because they don't need Sir Isaac Newton to talk to them about how he likes mushrooms and not olives on his pizza. So what does Sir Isaac Newton do? We talked about this in the past couple of weeks. What does Sir Isaac Newton do? He takes his massive mind and this huge theory that he has, and he finds one small detail. I don't even know enough about universal gravitation to give an example. Whatever, he brings the apple and he drops it on their head. This, right, according to legend, that happened. So, and he gives them that idea. And what do the kids do? The kids are like, "Oh my gosh, this is brilliant! This is amazing!" And hopefully they realize that this isn't all of it. This isn't all of it. There's much more to the theory. There's much more to Sir Isaac Newton. And if we learn more, we could get to that space, hopefully, of Sir Isaac Newton. So one thing, we do have to clarify that, first of all, Sir Isaac Newton's mind obviously is not infinite. But we don't really have any metaphor. There's no metaphor for infinite, really. But we're going to use Sir Isaac Newton's mind as a metaphor for the infinite. Excuse me. So you have how does it work? How does the structure work? How does Isaac Newton give this class? First, he is Isaac Newton. He has this entire theory within his massive mind, and it's limitless. It's functionally limitless. And he has to go fishing for this small little idea within that huge forest, that small little tree within that huge forest of his idea. Was that idea always there? Was that implication, that minor implication, that's the terminology we're going to use, was that minor implication of the grander theory always within Sir Isaac Newton's mind? Yes, but it was lost within the infinitude, again, quote unquote, infinitude of the rest of the theory, of the rest of his mind. If you ask Sir Isaac Newton in the moment, give me an example for a sophomore, to teach a sophomore the idea of universal gravitation, he'd be completely at a loss, because he can't find that minor implication within the grandeur, the infinitude of the greater idea. So what does he need to do? He needs to stop. He needs to remove himself, remove the entire theory, and go fishing for that focused minor implication that he could then take and give to the students. So what is he doing in this moment? He's concealing the rest of his great mind. He's concealing the rest of this great theory. There has to be, though, in order to get to that minor implication, what does he need to do? He needs to have a contraction. There has to be a tzimtzum. He has to focus himself a little bit. He has to make his mind smaller in order to find something within it that is accessible to the younger students, to the more limited students. So did anything actually change within Sir Isaac Newton? Is the greater theory still there? Yes. Is his functionally limitless mind still there? Yes. But for a minute, he stopped and he's like, 1 second, I need to find something that I can hand over to these kids within an hour-long lecture. And I got to stop and I got to think. I have to mitzamtzem. I have to find a tzimtzum. I have to contract myself, make myself smaller, give space to these kids to find that idea in order to give it over to them. So what changed? What functionally changed? It's a revelation. The infinite mind went from revelation to concealed. And the smaller idea, the minor implication, went from concealed to revealed. They kind of switched places. What's Isaac Newton's default state? When he wakes up in the morning, who is he at that moment? What's revealed when he wakes up, when he's thinking, when he's in his office? Who is thinking? What is being thought? The infinite, right? The grander theory, the grander idea, his functioning limitless mind. That's revealed. Within that is hidden the minor implication. That is concealed. But then when he gets that call that I have to go to the classroom to speak to them, then he conceals the greater implication and reveals the minor implication. This is the mashal, the parable that Chassidus gives for this doctrine of tzimtzum. Okay? And we're going to read a text, and then we're going to go through it step by step, the parable and the analog. Lisa, could you do me a favor? We're going to go, I have a couple of texts for you, so let's jump to page 149, please, if you don't mind. And text 4a on page 149.
Consider the example of a teacher imparting information to students. The profound concept the teacher understands is incompatible with the student's mental abilities. True, the profound concept contains less significant elements that are compatible with the student's mind. Nevertheless, in the teacher's mind, these elements are filled with the profundity of the overall concept, and they therefore remain too deep to deliver to the student. The main obstacle here is that there is no distinction in the teacher's mind between the core of the concept and its less significant elements. Consequently, if the teacher proceeds to transmit this knowledge to the student, the teacher will deliver the full profundity along with the less significant component. The students will understand none of it. The solution is for the teacher to conceal the entire concept, mentally pushing the whole idea aside to approach it anew. The teacher can now distinguish between the idea's core and the more superficial elements. The teacher can then deliver the transmittable details without flooding these elements with the overwhelming complexity of the core concept.
By the way, this is also something that we do all the time without even being aware of it. Whenever you create something, a piece of art, some music, or let's say you're even writing a love letter, you don't even realize how much tzimtzum you're going through, right? If I want to draw a painting that expresses all the feelings within my heart, it would be impossible because it is impossible. I have to focus it, I have to harness it and make it something specific. I have to constrain it. I have to be matzamtzem. So let's actually go through the parable step by step with the analog as well. The first stage is Isaac Newton wakes up in the morning. What does he have? He is Mr. Universal Gravitation. He has this huge, massive idea. So if he goes to Oxford and he hacks a China to his fellow professors, it's great. He doesn't need to change anything because they're peers. He could talk to them one-on-one. But this idea, this universal gravitational idea, is beyond the grasp of ordinary students. So what's the analog? Okay, they don't have the analog. We're going to have to go through the whole parable first and then go to the analog. Then, while he has this unbelievably complex and subtle idea that's beyond ordinary students, contained within that is the minor implication that even an ordinary student would be able to understand. But in the moment, that minor implication is lost as a tree lost in the forest. It's still a part of the unattainable ideal. Then what does Sir Isaac Newton have to do? He has to remove the entire theory of universal gravitation and focus on one small minor implication that he can go and give to these students. And then this idea becomes discoverable and it can be shared with other people. So what's the analog to godliness, to this idea of tzimtzum, the way it's described in Kabbalah? What's the first step of all of being? We're not even up to creation yet. What's the first step of all of existence? There's God's infinite light. And where is God's infinite light? Everywhere. There is no room for finite expression because the light is everywhere. You could use the metaphor of electricity. We'll talk about it soon, right? But remember we talked about that within God's infinite power is also the ability to be finite. Because if you say that God does not have the ability to be finite, you're limiting God, right? But where is this finite power? It's within divine infinity, but it's completely lost, so to speak, quote unquote, within the divine infinity. Because it's unappreciable because God is at this point completely infinite, and that infinite overwhelms everything else. So what does God do? God conceals his infinite light. It's still there, but we can't see it. And then God projects his finite power into the space of concealment. When we say the empty space, remember that Arizal said God created the empty space. We don't mean a literal empty space without godliness, because God is everywhere. But God takes that infinite power and conceals it. And what becomes revealed now? The finite power. Okay? Very, very simple. All right. Lisa, let's do text B, which describes the analog.
The above parable allows us to appreciate the concept of sin. Before the symptom, God's ability to express finite divinity was part and parcel of his prevailing infinity. Because the entire being of or and so becomes the symptom.
Before the symptom. Sorry.
Before the symptom is to reflect the infinite capacity of God's essence and to resemble it. The symptom enabled the separation of these two powers of expression.
God's finite abilities were always there. It's just the default state, so to speak, of godliness is the infinite power. Within the infinite power, you'll find the finite power, but we can't see it because the finitude is lost within the grander soup of the infinite. Make sense? Yeah? Makes sense? Wow, look at that. Let's give ourselves a round of applause. By the way, if you want to have another conversation about why there were great Kabbalists who took Tzimtzum literally, that is a worthwhile conversation, but after class. There is another school of thought that takes Tzimtzum literally, but that's a conversation for a later date. Also a fascinating conversation. Why we have these two schools of thought, the advantages and disadvantages of each. Really good conversation. But for the purposes of today's class, we're saying that Tzimtzum is not literal. Tzimtzum just means that God conceals his infinite light. Barbara.
I don't know, I'm thinking it like in terms of electricity.
Mm-hmm.
Electricity is always there, running through the wires, but you can turn the switch on or off.
And also we
But
have,
it's always there, even when the switch is off.
what's that what was the thing you said? Resistors? You also have resistors that you have the infinite functionally, right? If you go to the power station, there's an infinite amount of electricity. You plug anything into it, kaboom. There's no room for a finite amount of electricity. You can't power a microwave in a power station, right? Because electricity at that point cannot be harnessed. It can't be defined. We can't say we're going to charge my phone by plugging it into the reactor at Niagara Falls. Obviously, it's not a good metaphor for infinite because it is finite, right? But let's just assume it's infinite. So what do I need to do first? I have to remove most of the power and create a space that we have the resistors, whatever the wires, and we have a certain amount of voltage, a certain amount of amperage, all these wonderful things, until we're able to take a tiny little plug and put it in my phone so we could scroll Instagram, right? So
sunlight, let's say,
right,
creates a fire.
right.
It's about concentrating. We can see the same light is always there, but you just need something to
Right.
get together.
Yeah. So again, what we need to understand is that godliness, the way we're understanding Tzimtzum, is that God didn't go anywhere. God is there within the quote unquote Tzimtzum, within the quote unquote darkness. It's just that now the infinite light is concealed, and we're operating on a finite light frequency. Okay. You cool? All right.
So, I'll say something, this predated all this, what we're learning now, the Kabbalah, predated, astrophysics,
Predated, yeah.
But it's all there, this is the precursor to all this stuff, even with mathematics saying that the earth started as a seed, mustard seed, and it's under the Big Bang.
I don't know enough about the astrophysics to.
That a lot of it, I think, in the Kabbalah, they was seeded in many brilliant minds.
It's possible.
I think so.
I mean, we do know that many of the giants of the secular world of several hundred years ago did study Torah a lot. Yes, that is true.
It's not this stuff. It's there. I didn't invent the stuff created. It was there. We discovered it.
We're gonna jump ahead now. We're gonna jump ahead to what does this mean? Tzimtzum. We learned about Tzimtzum. That's great and it's wonderful. We learned about one type of Tzimtzum, by the way. There are many other types of Tzimtzum, but we learned about the Tzimtzum Rishon, the first Tzimtzum, the first contraction, the first concealment, where God decided we're going to operate on finite level instead of infinite level. We're going to conceal the infinite and reveal the finite. We learned about Tzimtzum. That's great. It's beautiful. What does this mean for me and you? Oh, by the way, Barbara's right. We got to look at the map. Where is Tzimtzum? We are here. I apologize. Tzimtzum Rishon, right up there. Lesson 5, all the way at the top. That inverted triangle situation. That's the Tzimtzum where God channels or conceals the or in Sof, the infinite light, into the finite light. You'll notice that this is level. This is lesson 5. Lesson 6 next week is not on the map. Not on the map. As to why lesson 6 is not on the map, you'll have to come to lesson 6 to find out.
Is it saying with told that this is the chaos?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so he filled it.
Yeah.
The order.
Jim.
It seems to me, in a sense, with that creating of that small dark, I'll call it darkness. We, with the road and doing good acts, we expand this light to eliminate that darkness.
Jimmy, you want to switch seats? You want to switch
yeah,
seats?
that's
After class. You want to switch seats? You give the rest of the class.
The concept in Stanislavski did this thing called the creative circle.
He's the method guy, right?
Yes, but it's not method, but we understand it, but the way it came from that. Where you could be one little man on stage holding a skull, Shakespeare.
Mhm.
If you're not creating it properly, you'll reach the first level of scenes.
Mhm.
By the time a person creates it, pure creation, like the Greeks thought theater was a gift from the gods, if you could do this. You could reach the person in the last row, and they would feel as if you were speaking right to them, for the center of the circle.
Okay.
Expanded outward. So it's, I mean, to me, that makes me understand this a little
All right. Beautiful.
better. If you're not creating in a negative sense, you put nothing into it, you reach,
If that's helpful, that's great. So now we're gonna. I'm sorry. I just don't understand anything about theater. I've never seen a show in my life. Yeah, for sure. No, for sure. So now we're gonna take Simpson and make it something relevant to us. So what is how is Simpson relevant to us? Have you ever had an experience talking to somebody where you tried talking to them and it was as if you just weren't there?
Yeah.
Could be work, it could be a family relationship, it could even, God forbid, even be a romantic relationship where it's as if you weren't there, right? And the person doesn't even steamroll you because what you said they didn't even hear what you had to say. Right? You're at a meeting and you say maybe we should do this quarter, that this quarter, and the CEO or whatever doesn't even hear you. It's not that he rejects your idea never happens. Why does that happen? Why is that the case? Because one of the things we're best at as human beings, one of the things that we are great at is taking up a lot of space. We're all about eating up a lot of space. I had a family member come back from a dinner out with a bunch of his friends, and one of the guys who turns out wasn't a great friend of his, he says, you take up so much space, right? You take up too much space. And this family member of mine was very offended. What do you mean take up too much space? And this is what we're talking about. You take up too much space sometimes. It's the default when we're born and we grow up as children and we focus on ourselves a little bit, and then when we become adults, the default setting for most of us is to take up a lot of space. And it's very dangerous when we take up a lot of space. Because one of the most powerful things that drive a human being is our sense of self, our ego. So what can we learn from God Almighty? That one of the things that we need to do is have a tzimtzum. We have to leave space for other beings. We have to leave space for other people. There's a great story that's described in text 6a. I'll read it together. Text 6a. This is one of my favorite Hasidic stories. It starts off with a discussion about ethics, and then it gets into a story. Those who are self-obsessed and narcissistic become engrossed in their desires and wishes and completely forget about God. Similarly, their self-obsession precludes loving others. Their self-love generates divisiveness because it doesn't allow them to tolerate others. They think that whatever someone else says or does is directed against them. There are certain people that whenever anybody says anything, it's like, oh, they're talking about me. How could they say that about me? No, you weren't even in the room. Nobody cares. Nobody thinks. Nobody was thinking about you in the moment. But they take everything personally, right? You could have a guy who comes to shul on Shabbos and the rabbi gives a speech and the rabbi's calling me out. What do you mean the rabbi's calling you out? The rabbi hasn't thought about you in months, right? What do you mean he's calling me out? Because everything's about me. That's the way a lot of people see themselves. There was an incident that well illustrates this point. A fellow who happened to be a tremendous scholar and well-versed in Torah once had a private audience, or yechidus, with my great-grandfather, Rabbi Nachum Mendel of Lubavitch. Rabbi, he complained, the others are stepping all over me in the study hall. They do not appreciate what I have to say. They do not behave properly towards me, and they do almost the exact opposite of my opinion. So this guy comes to his Rebbe, and he was an accomplished learner. He was an accomplished scholar. He was a real person, and he complains to the Rebbe, "They threaten mir." in Yiddish. They're stepping on me in the base medrash, in the study hall. They're stepping all over me. So the Rebbe says to him, you know what? If you fill up the whole study room, where else are people supposed to step? Right? If your ego, if your personality fills up the whole room, where are people supposed to go? What's the idea here? That when we let our ego run rampant, we take offense at everything that anybody has to say because it's all about me, because I am everything. There's no room for another person. This guy, by the way, the Rebbe makes this point in text 6b. Where did this story take? He comes to his Rebbe. He comes to his Rebbe and he has what we call a private audience with his Rebbe. And we stress that he was a Torah scholar. He was a real person. And where did he come? He came to his Rebbe, where he's supposed to be having a very high level spiritual conversation with his spiritual mentor. And he's saying that they're stepping on me weird. They're not stepping on me at the bowling alley or at work. They're stepping on me in the study hall. In the shul, they're stepping all over me. Because what's the danger? Because the ego is so powerful that even in the study hall, where we're all supposed to be working together to try to get closer to God, or whatever we're trying to accomplish in the study hall, hopefully, even there, this guy felt as if they're stepping all over him. Even within the base medrash, where you're supposed to be coming from a space of humility and a lack of ego, a lack of a feeling of self, he wasn't able to control himself. And this wasn't a simple person. This wasn't a nobody, right? He felt himself as a big deal because he kind of was a big deal. But he had a hard time working on himself to the point where he was able to limit his ego. Barbara, could you do me a favor and read text 6b on 157?
You will notice that the above story mentions that the individual felt like people were stepping all over him in the study hall. This is a highly instructive detail because a hall designed for Torah study is considered a miniature holy temple. Divinity is more acutely present and perceptible in a place filled with Torah study, similar to the presence of divinity within the holy temple. Despite that, this individual succeeded in maintaining a bloated ego even in this holy place. The detail of this story was included to underscore that knowledge alone, without working on self-refinement, is woefully insufficient. So much so that one's ego will infiltrate even a miniature sanctuary. This proves the indispensability of avodah, the internal work of character refinement.
There's a terminology in Kabbalah and Chassidus called avodah, which literally means work. And the way we're using it here in this context is self-refinement on personal work, emotional work. And the reason why we say avodah, because it means that it's actually work. It's not a walk in the park. Yes. I'm just using the Ashkenazi way of saying it. That it's hard work. It's not an easy thing. The way we're created, the way a human being is born, is that your ego, your sense of self, runs rampant. That's the way we are when we're born, and we have to kind of work on ourselves. We have to work on symptoms. It's not an easy thing. It's not something that you just wake up in the morning and you're mitzvahing yourself. You give space to other people. You have to work on yourself. You have to have this avodah. That you have to. What's the word that they use? You have to toil. You have to toil in order to make sure that you leave space for other people. You know what? Maybe my opinion is not always the right one. Maybe nobody even needs to hear my opinion right now. That's also a possibility, right? You don't always have to give your opinion. You don't always have to be the one to dominate the conversation. You don't always have to be the person to dominate whatever situation you're in. You have to give space to other people. And where do we learn this from? We learn this from, and we're also given this capability by God's initial symptom, that God wanted to make space for other beings. So God was mitzamsim himself. God contracted himself. That I am not going to take over everything. I'm going to give people space to have their own perspectives. Remember, we talked about a couple of weeks ago that every prayer ends off, every single Jewish prayer ends off, Oseh Shalom B'Mamav, right? Oseh Shalom B'Mamav. What do we do when we say Oseh Shalom B'Mamav? We take 3 steps back, right? At the end of every Amidah, at the end of every Kaddish, we take 2 steps back. Because how do I accomplish peace, real, true, lasting peace? By taking a step back, giving space to another person to also have a perspective, right? That's how you have real peace. I'm going to take my steps back, then not necessarily do I need to be at the forefront of this conversation. Maybe my opinions don't need to be heard right now. And even if they are heard, I could give space for the fact that your opinions are also valid. Your perspectives are also valid. What you have to say is also valid. And your feelings are obviously also valid. So the idea of tzimtzum within our lives, the first idea that we take from tzimtzum is giving space to others. Giving space to other people's ideas, opinions, and feelings. Something else that we can learn from tzimtzum, learning about this idea of tzimtzum, another way that this is important for us to learn about, is because of the idea of reciprocity. Did I get that right? Yeah, reciprocity. There's this idea in Judaism that kamayim hapanim al panim, that people are reciprocal. are reciprocal. Text, actually, Beatrice, now that you said that, could you read text 7, please?
159.
Yes.
Reciprocation is an actual response. God set aside, figuratively speaking, his great infinite light and concealed it. He did this due to his love for us, to raise us up with him. For love induces one to restrict oneself for another. When we reflect on this deeply, our souls will spontaneously be ignited to reciprocate. We will feel motivated to forsake everything in order to cleave to him.
So another reason why we should be learning about Tzimtzum is to realize that why did Hashem go through this entire rigmarole of Tzimtzum, of removing his divine light or his infinite light and projecting the finite light into the empty space, all this wonderful, great stuff? Because God wanted to have a relationship with who? With me. With me, by the way. It could lead to, it could, whatever, that's a separate discussion. But because God wanted to have a relationship with me, he went through the trouble, so to speak, of having a tzimtzum. So what should this engender within you? It should engender within you a feeling of reciprocity. That if God was willing to create space for me by constricting himself, by contracting himself, by limiting himself, so to speak, maybe it's all right if I make space in my life for God as well. Right? It's not unheard of to make space for God. If he's willing to make space for me, I should make space for him. That in everybody's life, there's some way that we could carve out a little bit of space that we could dedicate to godliness and goodliness. That's something that's accomplishable. That's something that's achievable. That's something that we can learn from Tzimtzum. That God was not content with the Or Ein Sof, with the infinite running amok. God wanted to have a relationship with a finite being, which is me. By the way, when I said that could lead to a sense of a big head, right? They say about one of the great Hasidic masters that he had two slips of paper in each of his pockets. One slip of paper, he had an expression that it says that Bishvili Nivra Olam. The Talmud tells us that every person has to say to himself, the world was created for me. And in the other pocket, he had another expression, that I am just dust and ash. What's this idea? On the one hand, this idea that God created the world for me, that the whole world was created for me, if you're taking it the wrong way, could lead to a sense of ego. But when we realize that God is only doing it because it's a responsibility, it's not only a privilege, it's more than a privilege, it's a responsibility, right? The Jewish people are called the chosen nation. Chosen for what? Right? Like Tevye said, maybe choose somebody else once in a while. It's not just a privilege, it's more so a responsibility to be the chosen people. To have a relationship to God because God chose you to live in this world in this circumstance. And all of creation, one way of looking at it, which you are supposed to, you're supposed to center your perspective within creation, right? That there's 7 billion people alive. How many tens of billion people lived before? I don't know. But God wanted you here right now in Staten Island at 11:28 on December 17th to be within this room, whatever experience you're going through. So one way of looking at it is that, who are you? Who do you think you are? You big-headed, you think God went to all this trouble just for you? But Kabbalah tells us, yes, that's true, but it's a responsibility. It should not lead to more ego. It should lead to a sense of massive humility. That I have a job to do right now in this space because God went through all this trouble in order to put me here for a specific reason. And this should not lead to a sense of ego. It's just the opposite. How much more do I have to give? If God went through all this trouble in order to make me happen, to make this situation happen, how much more do I have to give? And finally, the last idea that I want to talk about is this idea that Jimmy said we're created in darkness. We're created in darkness. One of the unique things about Jewish time is what? How does Jewish time work? When does Shabbos begin? Night, right? It was evening, it was day, one night. Shabbos starts at night. Yom Kippur starts at night. The Jewish day starts at night. And by the way, it's not that there's 14 different units in a week. There's nighttime and daytime. There's a unit of one complete 24-hour period where darkness precedes light. Evening always precedes day. Why is this? Why did this happen? Because God created the world in a way in which tzimtzum, concealment, precedes revelation. Let's read text A. Please, text A. Barbara, did I ask you yet? Okay. Anybody else? Can we have a volunteer to read text A? 8A on page 160.
I'll read it. There was evening and there was one day. This verse informs us that there is no day without a night that precedes it. Why must it be so? Why does the day not exclusively consist of daylight hours, or perhaps just the night hours? Why must it include both evening and morning? And why must night precede the day? The root of the matter is that At the source of the creation, there was evening before morning, that is darkness preceded light, for the Tzimtzum preceded the sharing part of kindness. This darkness-like combination extends to all worlds, including our world where night and day spin.
In the Jewish understanding of time, night always precedes day. Darkness always precedes light because that's the way God created the world. First there was a tzimtzum, and then there was a revelation. First there was concealment, and then God emanated those lights of Atzilus. Because what is the idea? What is the idea here? That darkness always precedes the dawn, so to speak, right? In order, if you did gain something without hard work, that means that you didn't gain everything that you should have. Correct? And everything in life. Think of something as silly as going to the gym, right? Going to the gym is easy, and when you lifting those weights, it doesn't hurt, or it's not hard. It's not hard for you to lift those weights. What are you accomplishing? You're not doing anything, right? You're maintaining at best. You're not growing. You're not becoming strong. You're not becoming buff. You're not getting into better shape. Because the way the world works is that there's always struggle before the reward. L'fum tzara agra, we say in the Mishnah, but according to the struggle, that's how much reward you get. If you want to become a professional in certain fields, you have to go through a lot of hard work, right? Doctors in the medical field, they love to destroy the interns, right? You have the 120-hour weeks or whatever it is. Why? I mean, I think it's crazy. There could probably be a better system, but the idea is that if through hard work, that's how you're able to come out on the other end a better, stronger, more impactful person. This is true of almost everything in life. When we struggle, that's how we gain reward. When we go through the darkness, when we live through that darkness, and you live in the darkness, that's how you're able to come out the other end more powerful than you were before. Shalom, could you read text AP, which describes this idea? It's a continuation of text 162, yeah.
We observe the same pattern reflected in the affairs of the world, whereby individuals do not achieve growth in wealth, leadership, building a family, study, or any other accomplishment, without first experiencing humiliation, pain, loss, and the like. For example, individuals engaged in study will not arrive at a complete understanding of the subject without much toil and stress, feeling distant from understanding and despair from mastering the subject. Indeed, the Talmud states, one does not understand statements of Torah without first being mistaken. We observe the same in earning a livelihood, whereby we succeed only after putting forth great effort and enduring much pain, even feeling despair. Only thereafter do we find profit and great blessing. This is a way that God's blessings flow in the upper world and travel down to the lowest realm. There is no light without the darkness that precedes it. As it is stated, according to the pain is the reward.
When things come easy, that means they're not earned. That also means that we're leaving things on the table, right? If you go through school, for example, and you breathe through school and you get a 4.0 GPA and it's easy without studying, that means that you're leaving so much more on the table. Because the only way to truly get every juice out of the lemon is by squeezing it. You have to put it through the ringer and in order to get everything out, right? No pains, no gains, things like that of that nature. It's something intuitive to all of us. We understand. And why is it this way? Why does the world look like this? That's something we all understand, that without pain, there can't be any gain. Because the world was created by God in such a way that Tzimtzum always precedes Or, that concealment always precedes the light. Another thing that kind of spins off of it from this, which is basically the same idea, but a little bit different, is that every darkness is in order to have a light at the end. Every trauma, so to speak, every struggle is in order to gain something from that darkness. This isn't a very easy thing for us to sit with. It's very hard for us to understand. There's this idea of theodicy, right? Like that book on the table right in front of us. If God is good, why can life be so bad? Which could be the entire subject of this entire course, not just today's class, right? How is it possible that if God is good, it can be bad sometimes for us? So Kabbalah tells us that while you're going through the bad, God is there too. And we can take comfort in that. That God is, remember we said that the Tzimtzum is not literal, that God did not remove himself. God's infinite light is always there. We just can't see it. God is with us within the struggle too. God is there in the darkness. It's on such a level where we can't appreciate the light because it's such a powerful light. But God is with us in the moment. And eventually there is a light at the end of the tunnel. For instance, the most famous darkness in Jewish history, up to in the Bible at least, was the slavery in Egypt, which we're starting to read about in the weekly Torah portion. And God explains to Moses that why did we put the Jewish people through the trauma of the slavery in Egypt? In order they could come out the other end better, in order to be able to go to Sinai to receive the Torah, become the people that I want to forge, the nation that I want to forge from the iron crucible It's actually the expression the Talmud uses. The Kur HaBarzel, the iron crucible of Egypt, will force the Jewish people into the nation, the light unto the nations, the chosen people, so to speak. God is there in Egypt. God was there too. Because God's infinite light is everywhere, even within the darkness. And the light is on such a level where we don't have the tools, we don't have the right glasses in order to be able to filter that light in order to be appreciated for the light that it is. And we struggle in the moment. And it is hard and it's not easy. But what's comforting is understanding that God is there with us at the time. That Tzimtzum is not Kipshute. That Tzimtzum is not literal. God did not remove himself from this world. Less asar panui minei, there is no place where he is not. When you're going through that trauma, we can't take comfort from the fact that God is with us, right there with us as well. But on the flip side, I want to make very clear that we don't seek out trauma. We don't seek out difficulty. We don't ask for it. We don't want the no pain, the pain in order to have the gain. That's not what we're looking for. If you remember, going back to the most famous Jew in history, the greatest Jew in history, when he goes to Egypt and God says, let my people go, and he goes to Pharaoh, what happens to the Jewish people? They suffer even more, right? And Moses is freaking out at God. Look in the Torah. Moses says to God, how can you do evil to these people? So did Moses not know this? That what's the point of the struggle in order to get to the reward at the end of the tunnel? Where did God reveal himself to him the first time? Remember we talked about it earlier in the class? In the thorn bush. Why did God reveal himself in the thorn bush for the first time? To show Moses that I'm with you in the pain, and the pain is only that we should be able to come back here to Sinai to get the Torah and this great revelation that's the light at the end of the tunnel. Moses knew all this. But he says to God, you are God. You're God Almighty. Come on, bro. You created this whole paradigm in which in order for us to gain great heights, we have to suffer. We have to struggle. We have to go through the darkness in order to get to the light. But at the end of the day, who are you? You're the Eibishter. You are God Almighty. When we say Almighty, what does that mean, Almighty? What does Almighty mean? He could do whatever, not just powerful. He's omnipotent. He could do whatever he wants. Change the paradigm. Why didn't he? We don't know. I can't give you a good answer. There's a video of Jonathan Sachs. My wife actually mentioned to me the other day that who got the last interview with Jonathan Sachs? Your friend from Crown Heights?
Wow.
So during COVID, this woman from Crown Heights who has a podcast, I don't remember what it's called, her and her sister have a podcast, and they were interviewing Jonathan Sachs, and they asked age-old question, the late, great Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs. She asked the eternal Jewish question, if, right there, Shalom, could you hold up that book in front of you? If God is good, why can life be bad? And Jonathan Sachs says, at the end of the day, we don't know. One of the books says, Ilu Yadaitiv Hayisiv. If I knew, I would be God. And why is it? Jonathan Sachs actually said, by the way, while he was giving this conversation, nobody knew at the time, but he was dying of cancer. He was having extremely painful cancer. He died 2 months later or something. But in the moment, he was suffering tremendously, massively. While she asked this question, why did the suffering happen to good people? He was actually living it. And he says, I don't know. I can't tell you. And I don't want to know. Why don't you want to know? The Rebbe actually once talked about it by Fabrenyan. The Rebbe, you probably know this. The Lubavitcher Rebbe started saying things like, we want Mashiach now. Right? That we have to demand that God should end this exile and bring the coming of Mashiach, which is the ultimate redemption, when we'll see all the good in a revealed and tangible way. By the way, whenever the Rebbe gave somebody a blessing, the Rebbe always signed off saying, B'toiv hanira v'anigla, good in a revealed and tangible way. Why? Because we know everything is good, right? It's all tzimtzum. God is there with you in the suffering. So there's no such thing as bad. It's all good. But the Rebbe said, we insist, I'm asking a blessing, B'toiv hanira v'anigla, it should be good in a revealed and tangible way. So when the Rebbe started talking about Mashiach, started saying things like, we want Mashiach now, that a Jew has to say, Ad Masa God, until when? Enough already. There were other great Jewish leaders who said, you're demanding things of God. Who do you think you are? Right? There's a plan. There's an ineffable plan. And there's a reason we're going through all this stuff. And like we're saying in today's class, before every light, there's a great tzimtzum. And we have to go through the struggle in order to get to the reward and all these wonderful, beautiful things. And the Rebbe said, okay. But like Moshe Rabbeinu said to God, like Moses said to God, you can change the paradigm. And the Rebbe said the reason why this is one question in Judaism that has never actually been answered satisfactorily. You could go, I'm pretty sure like 4 years ago, we gave a class about this question of theodicy. How could good things happen if God is good, how could bad things happen to good people? And all the answers, there's a lot of very life-affirming answers, very inspirational answers, but at the end of the day, it's not going to sit well with your neshama. It's not going to sit well with your heart. Why? Because God does not want you to understand. Because God wants us to demand enough that this isn't okay. Imagine you were God, so to speak, and you knew why somebody had to lose a child, God forbid. Right? That it's part of, you're able to see the bird's eye view and you can see how everything falls into place. And it's all part of God's plan, which is what we believe, right? Right? Believe that everything happens for a reason and it had to happen this way. That's part of what we believe. But if I was able to see that, if I was able to zoom out, have the God perspective on everything, and see why this person had to suffer, and I went to their Shiva house, and I said, and I'm sitting there, I understand why it had to happen. Can I actually empathize with that person? No, because it happened for a reason. I might not be stupid enough to say that to the person, right? That I know why it happened. But also at the same time, I wouldn't totally fully empathize with the person. I wouldn't feel their pain because it happens for a reason. When I take my kids to get a shot at the doctor, they're crying, they're hysterical. And I feel their pain. But at the same time, I don't actually feel their pain because I know why they need to get the shot. I know why Tati has to say that the doctor's going to take the needle and put it into your arm because it's in order to help you. And I see that because I can appreciate that. So I can't fully empathize with my child because I have that understanding. So when God does not want us to understand this, because he wants us to demand, ad masai, enough. You can change the paradigm, God, if you so choose. And that's what it means to ask for Mashiach. That's what it means to say that we want toiv hanir val nigla. We want good in a revealed and tangible way. That all these, it's a beautiful thing, by the way. It could be very life affirming, and it should be. Understanding that God is with us, and when we struggle, even in the darkness, God is holding our hand and guiding us through this, and we'll come out at the end. We will come out the other end of the tunnel better and stronger people.
He's there with night vision glasses. You understand there's light in the dark.
There's light in the darkness, right? We just can't perceive it. It's such a great light. It's a more powerful light, right? UV is a more powerful light than what we're able to see. Whatever the spectrum is called, I don't even know what it's called. The visible light.
Even David said, "Thy rod and thy staff will comfort me."
Yeah.
The rod is the thing.
So David said, but at the same time, David said, "Keli lemazavtani." God, why are you letting this happen to me? Even though David lived a life where he knew that all this is happening for a reason, and he suffered a lot. Right? You look at Psalms, David suffered a lot. At the same time, he said, the greatest Jew of all time, Moses said, "Lama reis lama zeh." He understood this idea better than all of us, that it's for a purpose. That the exile, that the Mitzrayim, that Egypt was in order to get us to Sinai. That's what Moses was all about. That was his whole mission in life. But still, he said, God, come on. Flip the switch. Paradigm. Change the paradigm. It's in your hands. You have the capability. So we have to take with us, it's two things that are kind of in contrast to one another, but because we are all spiritual, healthy people, we should be able to grasp both of these ideas at the same time. On the one hand, while we're going through the struggle, understand that God is here with us, and it's for a reason, and that's what makes us better people. But at the same time, we're also allowed to tell God that we don't want this anymore, that should not be the paradigm anymore. There was a story, the Frierdiker Rebbe, the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, was arrested for his Jewish activities in the Soviet Union in the 1920s. And he was actually sentenced to death. And they physically tortured the Frierdiker Rebbe. And in text 9, he says that if somebody would offer to sell me a single moment of additional suffering for $1 billion, I wouldn't buy it. But if someone would offer to purchase a single moment of my suffering for $1 billion, I wouldn't sell it.
I don't know.
We're not looking, we don't look for the struggle. We don't want the struggle. While we're in it, we have to be able to have this idea of tzimtzum and or, the constraint, the concealment, and the light. That God created the world in such a way that for every dawn is preceded by a darkness. That lefum tzara agra, that according to the struggle is the reward. But at the same time, we're also, I think we should demand of God an masay enough. Viful ashir would say Nidish. How much? How much already? It's too much. Yeah. So we have to have all these ideas in our head at the same time. That tzimtzum is not literal. God is here with us in his infinite power. And God's light is in this world as much as it is in the highest worlds, even before the tzimtzum. The tzimtzum is not literal. And we have to take this idea of giving space to other people, to be mitzantzum ourselves, give space to other people, give space to God. And when we go through the struggles, we understand, we can appreciate that it's for a purpose and God is with us in the darkness. I think that we also have to demand that it's also not okay. It's not okay. And we want God to change the paradigm. And I don't know, maybe it's heretical, but whatever. I'm okay with it. I'm sorry? Exactly. I mean,
But we
people.
got Israel.
But again, when the people asked the Rebbe why the Holocaust,
Really?
after guys, we're gonna put in back. This is a classic after class conversation. Okay, classic after class conversation. We have to be able to have both of these ideas in our head at the same time. That while we know why we're going through, we don't know why, but we know there's a reason why we're going through what we're going through. At the same time, God could also give us light and good in a revealed and tangible way. Ad Masa, enough. We have to demand an end to suffering. What's happening in Eretz Yisrael, right? We as Jews believe that it's happening for a reason. It's part of God's grander, ineffable plan. But at the same time, we could also say, figure out another way. Figure out another way. Figure out another way. You are omnipotent. We call you the Abisher. We call you the Almighty because you have the ability to change the paradigm. And we don't understand why he chose to do it this way. And we could demand Ad Masa, we could demand enough is enough and change that paradigm. Before I let everyone go, we're going to watch a video with our friend in the V-neck gray sweater where he talks about Kabbalah and stuff. Malka, what?
Welcome to our fifth video on the world of Kabbalah, a journey through the mystical layers of the Kabbalistic system. We previously described the disparity between God's infinite light and the 10 sfirot of Atzilut that have definitions and distinctions, and therefore limitations. How can absolute infinite divinity give way to a finite form of divinity, the 10 sfirot? The transition cannot be gradual because it's impossible for infinity to devolve into something finite. So what enabled such a drastic leap? The good news is that 16th century Rabbi Yitzhak Luria explained this puzzle. The bad news is that it's a complex topic. So we'll just give a sample here. The idea is called tzimtzum, which means contraction. God contracted his infinite light, disrupting its infinity to support the emergence of the finite sfirot. The Kabbalists used metaphoric imagery. God pushed aside the light to form an empty void, into which he beamed a single straight light of illumination that evolved into the cosmos. Now, if that's not mysterious, nothing is. So let's clarify. The tzimtzum did not remove God from anywhere or anything. So what did it achieve? Well, if you recall, in an earlier video, we described a scientist struggling to share an abstract, complex theory with teenage minds. He's forced to pause and rethink his presentation. After identifying a relatable detail within the theory, he shares just that detail with the students, who are blown away at the genius of it. It took the scientist time and effort to identify the detail. Why is that? Because the detail was lost in the forest of a complex theory. It didn't have its own identity. So how did he identify it? He stopped focusing on the theory. The idea remained in his mind, but he decreased the intensity of his focus, which created the mental space to hone in on a minor detail. That's the tzimtzum. Nothing is impossible for God. He has both the ability to be infinite and to be finite. The difference is that his infinity is naturally revealed. That's the infinite light. While his ability to be finite is lost in the background, like the scientific detail overlooked in the context of a complex theory. Just as the scientist reduced his focus on the entire theory to allow a detail to become visible, so did God reduce the focus on his infinite power to allow his finite power to operate. So when the Kabbalists say that God made an empty space for creation, it's not actual space and it's not actually empty. It's a shift between two layers of divine focus. And when they talk of a single straight line, they mean God's ability to be finite, which is what allowed the 10 sfirot, finite forms of divinity, to emerge. How is that relevant to us? We exist thanks to the process of tzimtzum, but the tzimtzum is not a true withdrawal, just a concealment of focus. So even when we feel that God is withdrawn from our world, it pays to remember that we remain within God's infinite light, although it's concealed from our perception. Knowing that makes it easier to personally relate to God. And the fact that God initiated this drastic step of tzimtzum to make space for our existence should inspire us to create space for His presence in our lives. After all, it's just a matter of focus.
All right. So that's it for today for lesson 5. Gonna end the recording. Next week.